Early implied there. So many of you might have noticed that it's hard to even open the newspaper without seeing Facebook mentioned in some fashion. Like, for example, yesterday, I saw something about how the soccer/football star Ronaldo, his wife is pregnant, and the way that was announced was on Facebook and also on Twitter. That kind of thing is just routine these days. And really, it goes beyond that. Now, whether the subject is foreign affairs, immigration, sports, retailing, I just wrote a few, social trends, families, Facebook is very likely to be mentioned in routine coverage of whatever might be happening. Now, why is that? That is basically what I call the Facebook effect. And the Facebook effect, which is the title of my book, as I see it, is the phenomenon that's born out of the existence of a fundamentally new form of communication, a fundamentally new form of empowerment for individuals, because I really think that's sort of the single most important thing that Facebook represents, is a new way to kind of give a voice to ordinary people. And I'll talk about how that sort of manifests itself in a lot of ways, but I just think it's important sort of as a subtext for everything I say about Facebook to keep in mind this is the way I view it, as a platform for empowerment. Now, it's not the only one. There's a lot about Twitter here at the conference, and I'll be mentioning some things about Twitter as I go on, but Facebook is by far the largest such platform, and it's really the largest such platform. It's the largest platform of a lot of kinds that has ever existed. But it really is a new form of communication with unique characteristics. And that's really why I wrote the book. Now, I start the book with an anecdote set in the upstairs bedroom of a 32-year-old computer programmer in Barranquilla, Colombia, which might not seem the most obvious place to begin a book about Facebook. But the reason I did is because it was in that bedroom on January 4th, 2008, that this young man named Oscar Morales created a simple group on Facebook as just an individual member, ordinary person like all of you who use Facebook, which was devoted to stopping FARC, the guerrilla movement that has been a major threat and curse in Colombian life for decades. And because he was on Facebook, he had the trivially easy ability to go on and create a group, which anybody in this room can do, devoted to any topic, and he chose no more lies, no more kidnapping, no more killing, no more FARC, or maybe in a different order. And so he went to bed at 3 a.m., and he sent an invitation to all his friends on Facebook, of whom there were about 100. He woke up in the morning, and the group had 1,200 members. That got his attention. So it was the holidays, so he went to the beach with his family. And he came home from the beach that afternoon, and he found the group had something like 3,000 members. And why is that? Well, the reason is that he somehow tapped into a meme or idea or set of feelings that was abroad anyway, and that he somehow articulated and led people to coalesce around. And he's just an ordinary person, again, like any of you could do this. The thing that makes this a noteworthy story is that 1 month to the day after he did that, on February 4th, 2008, 10 million people went into the streets of Colombia in every city, in every town, and in a number of cities around the world, a total of probably 2 million outside of Colombia, even in places like Dubai and Hong Kong, Tokyo, Colombians and people who were sympathetic to the plight of Colombia, with this simple message: no more lies, no more killing, no more kidnapping, no more FARC. And that is, to me, a kind of classic example, or perhaps the ultimate thus far example of the Facebook effect. And again, what's happening there is an ordinary person, didn't even have to create a website, didn't know how to do anything except to express an opinion, and the consequence a month later was 10 million people in the streets of his country. Now, admittedly, it's an exaggerated example. It's an unusual example. But there are innumerable similar examples that range from people concerned about a pothole on their street, to people coming together to have an impact on the election of Barack Obama, to people becoming fans of, for example, a candy bar that Cadbury withdrew from the British market, and members of Facebook in the UK joined a group, a large group that became, I believe, 900,000 members saying, bring back this stupid candy bar, and like 3 months later, they brought it back. Or, Betty White going on Saturday Night Live. Everybody's read about that or seen the show, which was very funny. And, the Betty White story, in case anybody doesn't know it, a bunch of I think probably just one individual, I don't know how it began, but somebody or a small group of people on Facebook decided they wanted Betty White to host Saturday Night Live. So they created a group or a page for that, and not too much longer after that, Lorne Michaels noticed it, and he decided, well, if this many hundreds of thousands of people think it's a good idea, maybe we should try it. And I think now they're trying to get somebody else on there, and I'm trying to remember who, but anyway. This is the Facebook effect, and it's one of many different kinds of effects, but it's one that I'm especially interested in, particularly because of its political ramifications. And Facebook does have surprising implications for politics, as the Colombian example shows, as the impact of Facebook in the election of Barack Obama shows. Facebook was a key factor in Obama's election in this respect, that the sort of latent support that he quickly acquired among certain influential young people became visible very rapidly using this new infrastructure that Facebook created. And it basically made it acceptable to declare your support for Obama at a quite early stage, and then made it very easy for the Obama campaign, each individual subgroup, community subsection and state subsection of, all had Facebook pages, to gather their members for offline demonstrations and neighborhood work, etc. So it's not like Facebook elected Obama, but it gave a set of tools that enabled him to reach out to his potential public much more rapidly. So what is Facebook? Facebook is 500 million people, active users, 6.5 years after it was created in a dorm room at Harvard University, in every single country in the world, growing 1 million new users a day. Now, one of the things that I have really discovered since I wrote this book, and it came out about a little less than a month ago, is a lot of people still they don't really grasp what's going on with Facebook. Some people really still wonder, why would I even bother to write a book about it? Because it seems so sort of banal in a certain way. We all use it, it's just sort of there. It just seems to have kind of popped up out of nowhere, and everybody uses it, and what's the big deal? And in a way, that's one of its amazing qualities of success, is that it acquired that stature of sort of a quotidian part of modern life faster than almost any phenomenon that you can name, of any type. Name something else that grew to 500 million people using it actively in 6 years. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find any commercial, political phenomenon of any type that has grown that quickly. I say in the book that it may be the world's fastest growing company in history, measured by the number of its customers. So, it's not just, as many people would kind of stereotype it, who don't use it in particular, a way for teenagers to communicate about whether they're going to meet later at the mall, which they do on it, but that's by no means all that it is. So what is it that Facebook does uniquely that allows it to have all these qualities of empowerment? And what is it that led it to vanquish Friendster and MySpace and these other social networks that preceded it? Because we know social networking was not a new idea. This wasn't the first one to come along. In fact, I have a whole chapter in the book of the history of social networking, and there was a lot of stuff that preceded it. Many of them had similar features, but there were none that had this exact combination of features, and those were being based around genuine identity. You use your real name on Facebook. That is a huge difference from MySpace. That's the single biggest difference with MySpace, which was, when Facebook emerged, the dominant social network. And once you use your real name, then you can use Facebook to connect with your real friends, and they know it's you, and you know it's them, and then that creates this whole vast universe of other opportunities that can happen. Applications that can be built, functions that convenience factors for you, a whole set of features that Facebook can build and that its partners can build, but only because you use your real name, you say who you really are, you put your real information on there, and you identify who your real friends are. Now, we all know Facebook, like anything, can be gamed. There is a small percentage of users on Facebook, names who are fake, but it is a very small subset in the larger picture, and Facebook is based on real names. You can't get much use out of it if you don't use your real name. And by the way, something that a lot of people don't really realize is that even though you can make up a name and go onto Facebook as anybody, the thing that ultimately validates you is not that you say you are who you are, but that your friends become your friends, and in doing so, confirm that you are who they think you are. So you are in effect validated by the friend connection. So all these things are connected. And then, once you have this genuine identity-based social graph, as Facebook calls it, that's their term for this set of friend connections, then Facebook, because it's a very powerful set of software technologies, allows this amazing set of viral movements of information to occur through that group of people that are connected. And Facebook is a network for viral communication. And it does that with extraordinary efficiency. That's another thing that is not often recognized, even by those of us who use it routinely. It just seems to work, or we seem to get the information we want about our friends. But the fact is, it's a viral communications tool of unprecedented efficiency and sophisticated design. And another thing that I would say in differentiating it from systems that preceded it is that Facebook is basically a better software system than any social network that ever came along. I mean, notably, if you compare it to Friendster or MySpace, both of them were basically created by party guys, literally. People who wanted to connect with other people because they like to go out to clubs. That is literally true of the two guys that created MySpace and Jonathan Abrams, who started Friendster. And that's fine. But they did not bring the mindset to Facebook that Larry Page and Sergey Brin brought to Google, or that Bill Gates brought to Microsoft, which is the mindset of a computer scientist, an engineer who is absolutely devoted to constant technological improvement and iteration and sophisticated software functionality that is, and also the mindset that an intelligent engineer brings in this current environment of unfettered and fervid competition on the internet, that if you stick still with anything for 2 minutes, somebody will overwhelm you with something new. So Zuckerberg, like those other guys that have created these globally world-altering services, had that only the paranoid survive mentality that Andy Grove articulated long ago, which is absolutely necessary for survival and success on the internet. And this is one reason why Facebook changes all the time, to the point that many of us are frustrated by that. But it is in the DNA of Mark Zuckerberg, who created Facebook. Actually, I'm going to come back to Zuckerberg in a minute, but well, let me say one other thing about what Facebook's technology does uniquely, and that is that it's a platform for software that it creates and that others create. And that, too, was kind of a revolutionary thing when Facebook first inaugurated it in May of 2007. It had already built a few of its own applications, notably Photos, which was a new application that Facebook built for its own service that instantly became the most popular thing on Facebook. And to this day, it's probably the most popular thing that people do on Facebook, is put up photos and view photos. Particularly viewing photos is still the #1 activity on Facebook, although games may be overwhelming it in the aggregate if you look at gaming generally. So this issue of being a platform, Facebook became a platform. That same year, the iPhone launched and it became a platform. And really, this whole idea of products as platforms really has taken on a whole life of its own since that 2007 year, primarily because of the iPhone and Facebook, and a number of other services have come along and do similar things. Obviously, earlier systems like Microsoft Windows were platforms, but they were platforms in a much narrower, more circumscribed universe, on your PC. These were internet and communications platforms that allowed others to bring their services into whatever universe they were controlling, and it's unbelievably powerful. So another thing, though, that can't be left out in discussing what makes Facebook unique is Mark Zuckerberg himself. And, I think that if you would say, I wrote the book because I believed the importance of this empowerment quality that Facebook has. But I guess in retrospect, I'm realizing, especially in light of the dialogue about Facebook that is abroad at the moment, and the incipient arrival in October of this movie called The Social Network, which is going to be a distorted account of Facebook's first year, that even when I first started working on the book in early 2008, one of the reasons I wrote it was to explain that Mark Zuckerberg is not a jerk. Because if you're in the technology industry, or if you pay even the most minimal attention to it, you will know that that's kind of the meme that still prevails in many circles in technology, that Zuckerberg stole the idea from these kids at Harvard, that he's, running roughshod over our privacy because he doesn't give a damn about us. I did have the good fortune to get to know him quite well, both before and during my writing of the book. And the book is, to a large extent, a biography of Mark Zuckerberg, who is an absolutely extraordinary, unique human being who arguably is having more impact on the world we all live in than almost anyone else you can name. And he is not doing it because he's a jerk, or worse words that probably ought not to use since this is supposedly going out on the radio, but that are often used about him. He's actually a really amazing visionary. I have tremendous admiration for his achievement, which I make no apology about. If I didn't, I wouldn't have even embarked on this book. In fact, I even explain in the book that it was meeting him in September of 2006 that made me initially realize this company was different than I thought, because it had a leader like him, who was at the time only 22, in charge. And oddly, bizarrely, not only is Zuckerberg in charge, but he is absolutely, unequivocally, and inarguably in charge in a way that you never see in almost any company. He cannot be removed, which is a really weird fact. That is a historical aberration, which he owes to Sean Parker, one of his early partners, and I tell that story in detail in the book, and Sean Parker is a major figure in Facebook's history that I won't go into further now, but a fascinating guy. But because Zuckerberg has absolute control of Facebook, you have to really pay close attention to what he thinks and what he believes, because he defines what it is very, very completely. So just let me quickly touch on this question of, did he steal the idea? Because if you go to the movies in October, you are very likely to go to see that movie, because it's probably going to be a really good movie from the standpoint of entertainment. It's being written by Aaron Sorkin. It's produced by Scott Rudin and Kevin Spacey, directed by David Fincher. These are like the major players in the movie industry, basically. The stars, Justin Timberlake plays Sean Parker, Jesse Eisenberg plays Mark Zuckerberg. But even the first page of the screenplay, such as the one that has been leaked, has a fundamental error, because it says, in describing Mark Zuckerberg when it first introduces him, it says he masks a deep hidden anger or something like that. This is so far from Mark Zuckerberg that it's ludicrous. He is not an angry person. Anybody here who knows him knows that anger is not the thing you would use to describe him. But the point is, he was a Harvard undergraduate, and at Harvard at the time, other people were experimenting with similar kinds of software. He did a lot of things that put him uniquely in the position to do this, but this whole question of did he steal it arose because there were a couple of older kids, I guess they were all seniors when he was a sophomore, who were trying to do a party system, basically, something much more like Friendster, and they asked him to help out with it. They never paid him any money, but he did spend quite a bit of time working on it, supposedly, and then he basically sandbagged them. He did deliberately not really follow up, and then he launched Facebook. And clearly he was extremely rude in that chain of events. But, having been writing about technology for more than 20 years, I can tell you that, well, first of all, in the history of social networking that I tell in the book, I think I make it quite clear that even though he may have, by some definition, stolen a few ideas from the Winklevoss twins and Divya Narendra, there's nothing that they were trying to do that they didn't steal from somebody else. Because this whole set of ideas was in the wind. There were social networks that had developed at the exact same time or in earlier months that same year at Yale, Columbia, Baylor University, Stanford, and elsewhere. So college-based social networking was in the air, as these things often are. So if he stole anything, they stole it from somebody else. But more importantly, ideas are only about 1% of success in successful businesses of any kind, particularly in the internet, where execution is the reason why Facebook got to 500 million. You cannot say that if the Winklevoss twins and Divya Narendra had not had the idea, quote unquote, stolen from them by Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook would be what it is today. It would probably have disappeared and you would probably never have heard of it, and it wouldn't have been called Facebook, of course. But the point is, Mark Zuckerberg is a uniquely visionary leader and strategist, and that's why Facebook is what it is today. And to understand more of what I think about that, you have to either ask a good pointed question later or else read my book. But I wanted to read something. Oh, here's another thing. I'm going to read something in a minute that a friend of mine sent me just today about Zuckerberg. Well, I'll read this first. This is a friend of mine just read my book, somebody who used to write about Microsoft in the 80s at Fortune, and a longtime friend of mine. And he was making the comparison with Gates, which is a comparison I make in my book. By the way, how much time have I got? Oh, good. So I'm on track, roughly. I'm going to go to questions and comments shortly. But so this is my friend. The power of the guy's vision, the realized capacity to genuinely influence the planet, the genius, power, and never-beforeness of it, and the downside, too, of a boy geek who hasn't lived, doesn't yet understand either himself or the world, exercising vast influence from a stance of ambition darkened by unwisdom. He's making up words there, but he's comparing him to Bill Gates in all those qualities. This unbelievable vision, this unbelievable inexperience, and yet this capacity to realize the vision nonetheless and to sort of stumble through these amazing sets of choices, often clumsily, but still come out the other side, generally with success. But an interesting thing about Zuckerberg, too, that's worth mentioning, that occupies a fair number of pages in the book, is his attitudes towards money. Because number one, he doesn't even like advertising. He actually thinks advertising as a conceptual idea is annoying. He hates it. He doesn't like to see it, and he believes that if it's in Facebook, it ought to be useful. So it's led him to be kind of hostile to what normally an internet entrepreneur would have embraced long ago. But it's one of the reasons Facebook looks so simple and pure and has such little visual clutter. And I would argue it's one of the reasons Facebook has grown so fast. But another aspect of his attitude towards money is that he has been offered money to buy Facebook, to sell it, on so many occasions that it's almost a joke. I just wrote some of the numbers. I won't tell you all the companies and potential buyers, but in May 2004, he turned down $10 million for it, when it was 4 months old. In February of 2005, he turned down $75 million for it. In late 2005, early 2006, he turned down $750 million for it, with additional earnout. In the summer of 2006, he turned down $1 billion for it. And then the real amazing one was in the fall of 2007, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer offered him $15 billion in cash for Facebook. His own personal takeaway from that would have been in the vicinity of $5 billion. He didn't even consider accepting it. He was 23 years old. Now, if that isn't an amazing story, I don't know what is. To me, that's worth writing a book about. But it also says a lot about who this kid is and what he thinks he's accomplishing. He's not doing it for the short-term hit. I think that's kind of evident from that story. Just a couple quick things before we go to the discussion part, which I really relish and I'm eager to talk to you all. But You know, Facebook and privacy is a really big issue that's being discussed a lot lately because they've made some gaffes and they had to step back lately. This is something they've done repeatedly over their history. Facebook has a whole history of missteps on privacy. But you'd have to call them relatively minor missteps because even though they began as early as right around the time I first met Zuckerberg in September of 2006 when they launched the news feed, on through several interface design changes and moving the feed around and the terms of service controversy and the beacon advertising debacle and then this recent everyone privacy setting last December and then the changes in May that made everyone realize just how theoretically scary the everyone privacy setting was. Throughout all that, they've kept growing nonstop. So what happens in these incidents is Zuckerberg takes a little bit too big of a step forward towards exposing data about his users without asking their permission. And then there's some kind of an uproar. The biggest one by far was when the newsfeed was launched, when Facebook had 10 million members and over 1 million of them were actively protesting the newsfeed, 10% of all of his users actively protesting. But the irony, of course, is today the newsfeed is the central feature of Facebook without which we wouldn't even want to use it. And he's very aware of that. But what he does is, he makes these changes, people are uncomfortable, he tweaks a few privacy settings, like in the newsfeed he was allowed you to make a few changes in what people see, what stuff, and then he went on his merry way, and that's happened time and time again. He just did it again. He introduced privacy controls in, was it late May or early June, which almost no one will use, sadly. I think they should use them, by the way, but almost no one will use those changes. And the privacy controversy has essentially gone away. Even though it dominated a lot of business coverage for some weeks, it certainly was a subject of obsession in the technology industry. And I'm not saying that he's right about this, by the way. But the reason this happens is that Zuckerberg believes that the world is becoming more transparent. This is sort of the motive for starting Facebook in the first place. And he is always trying to sort of position Facebook for the world he inevitably sees emerging, because he doesn't want to be left behind by all the other innovation that Foursquare and Twitter and everybody else is generating right underneath his feet. And he actually does believe things about your privacy that you may not agree with. He thinks that you probably are not going to be able to control information about yourself that flows around the internet. And he wants to have a service that works for you at the day when you can't control it anymore. And that's a little bit contradictory, but that's what he thinks. And I think he's probably going to get pushed back much harder on that in coming years. And in fact, one of the things that I feel very strongly about Facebook and privacy, and those of you who use it actively know, I hope, that you can put your friends into groups. And friend groups in Facebook work in two ways. They determine who you see information about. You can put people in a group where you never see anything about them and they're still technically your friend on Facebook. And they also, more importantly, determine who sees information about you. But in order to adjust them for all those things, for those two major things, you have to spend a little time doing that. And like I said before, even though Zuckerberg recently made that somewhat simpler, most people still don't do it. And the friend groups are basically much too hard to operate. I believe if it was easy to put friends into groups, family, best friends, college friends, work friends, Ideas Festival acquaintances, each one of those groups you want to expose in a different way to your information, obviously. And if it was really easy to control that by just simple drop-down menus every time you saw a name or something like that, then I think Facebook would feel a lot safer to all of us, would probably end up getting used more, and actually, I believe it's inevitable Facebook will introduce that over time. But it does go slightly contrary to Zuckerberg's own ethos, which is that basically information is effectively uncontrollable, and it's better if more people see more things about each other. So he's kind of got to get over that hurdle, and he hasn't yet. Another thing that I think about Facebook privacy long term, and we can talk about this more as we go forward, but Facebook has basically been an opt-out system up to now in many ways. You sort of opt in the essence when you join it and you set yourself up, so that's fundamentally opt-in. But Ever since you got into Facebook, anytime Zuckerberg made a change, in order to get away from it, you had to opt out. And that is a big criticism that the privacy advocates and government leaders in many countries now are making about Facebook, that when something like the everyone privacy setting is introduced, when, for example, last December, all of your friends were suddenly made completely public to everyone on Facebook, which was the way it was from December through May, that should not be something Facebook imposes on you. It should be something that you have the right to choose. And the reason it isn't is because Facebook knows if it was opt-in, then fewer people would do it, less information would be flowing, there'd be less activity on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So, you could argue it's for commercial reasons, or you could just argue it's for usage reasons, but in either way, it would be to their disadvantage. It would be to our personal advantage. I do believe it will be forced on them. I would like to see it happen. I think Facebook should go to opt-in for all these kinds of things. But I want to just point out something about Facebook's privacy that I think a lot of the critics don't think about as they ought to. Facebook's privacy was basically baked in from the beginning. The reason we all put so much data about us in Facebook is because from the beginning it was by far the most protected environment that had ever existed on the internet. There was never any place on the internet before Facebook came along where you put in your email address, your cell phone number, your real friends, the things you really cared about, which most of us do, or many of us do anyway. I know I have my cell phone and my email in there, and I don't have any compunction about doing that because only my friends can see it. Facebook gave me those controls from the day I joined it. And even way back in February 2004 at Harvard, Facebook gave its members tremendous control of who saw their data. So Facebook has had extreme privacy from the beginning. Another simple thing about Facebook privacy that people don't realize is that when my daughter, for example, who's 18, makes her information completely accessible to every 18-year-old in New York City that she knows, who number about 750 people, right? She is still using Facebook's privacy settings very aggressively because there are two very important people who do not have access to that information. Me and my wife. This is typical of a teenage American in most countries. They use Facebook's privacy settings very cannily and very actively. It seems rudimentary, but by not allowing me to see those parties of her drunk last night, or the pictures of the party or whatever, she's getting what she wants. She couldn't care less about all the 18-year-olds, what they see. She cares about just a small number of people, and it gives her that power. So it's just worth noting that. Now, I want to just briefly say a couple quick things about Twitter, because Twitter is a hugely important service that I think is often incorrectly compared to Facebook. I don't think they are as similar as many people would have you believe who write about them in the general press and in the business press. First of all, Facebook is based on genuine identity. Twitter is not. Some people choose to use their real identities in Twitter. Some people don't. I know of the people who follow me, probably at least a third of them use some kind of pseudonym or a handle or some kind of name that is not obvious who they are. But even more importantly, after it's not based on your real name, it is not based on a bidirectional connection between two people. On Twitter, you subscribe to somebody's feed. They don't subscribe to you by definition when you subscribe to them as you do on Facebook. A Facebook friendship is a two-way connection. Twitter is, in that way, in my opinion, effectively and intrinsically a broadcast medium that is extremely valuable for public people, media, politicians, marketers, companies, all of whom increasingly use it to great effect and with great intelligence. But it is not like Facebook, which is a system primarily designed to communicate with the people you already know in the real world. That's what it was designed for at the beginning, and that is still primarily how it's designed, although it does now have other qualities that muddy the waters. And in fact, a year and a half ago or so, when Facebook was feeling particularly paranoid about Twitter's very rapid growth at the time, Zuckerberg and his colleagues went to great lengths, first to try to buy Twitter, according to all the reports, but when they failed, they essentially built all the features of Twitter into Facebook. So now, in the form of a Facebook page, which is not a bidirectional connection, to which you just become a fan or you say you like it, then you get the broadcasts from that page, but it doesn't have any awareness, or the person who operates it doesn't have any awareness necessarily of who you are. They don't see what you do. That's very similar to a Twitter connection. But here's the interesting thing about that. Even though Facebook has built in most of these qualities that Twitter has, it's not used that way, and Twitter still overwhelmingly dominates the traffic in credible voices on the internet. And I think it's fascinating to observe how the media, sports leaders, celebrities, companies still generally find Twitter a far more effective medium for broadcasting to large communities than Facebook, even though it can be done inside Facebook. And it's going to be an interesting thing to watch in coming years to see whether Facebook can draw some of that traffic back inside Facebook or not. I have no idea whether that will happen or not. So, last thoughts. Facebook's long-term strategy is not really what you would guess. Facebook does not want to be the biggest social network on which everyone in the world has an identity, necessarily. They kind of do want to do that, but they want to do it in a different form. They don't want it to be in the form of Facebook.com, which is the way we think of Facebook today. They want Facebook to move towards becoming infrastructure, where Facebook software, your identity, your friend connections, all sort of submerge below the surface of the internet. They maintain that data. They allow you to go in and manipulate and control your profile, etc., and connect with who you want to connect with. But your consumption of that data increasingly does not happen on Facebook.com. And this is primarily what they announced in April, which was kind of missed in a lot of the coverage about the privacy stuff. But basically what happened in April was Facebook, for the first time, really made a big deal about creating all these new functions that allow any website to use the features and the networks created by Facebook for their own purposes in order to tap into that virality that Facebook enables, so that any website, whether it's the Aspen Institute's website or whether it's David Kirkpatrick's website or any one of yours or any company, whether you're large or small, you can use the Facebook Connect infrastructure, you can use the like button and other things they're going to introduce over time, and basically have all that information flow through Facebook, even though you're operating outside Facebook. And increasingly, even the consumption of the news feed will probably occur outside Facebook, just as, for example, it does today in something like TweetDeck. That's a function that's been available for a long time, and Facebook's leaders, including Zuckerberg, believe long-term that's the way we're going to use Facebook. We're not going to go to Facebook.com. It's just going to be infrastructure. And if you think about it, it's a much more defensible position for them to be in, because they have so many users, they have a sort of unique ability to create that infrastructure, but it's also a very contradictory and somewhat controversial position in terms of the history of the internet, because never before has one company in that way controlled a piece of the internet's infrastructure. It'd be a little bit like if Microsoft had completely won the battle with Netscape and Internet Explorer was the only browser you could use, which of course didn't happen. But in a way, that's sort of what Facebook's ambition is with this social networking data, and it's a very controversial vision. I don't think it's necessarily going to play out that way, but that's where they're trying to go. And if you look at what that implies, one of the things it implies is that governments and regulators and privacy advocates all over the world are going to be increasingly paying closer and closer attention to Facebook, because its ambition is so vast, and it has to do with our data. Data that historically governments have considered themselves the guardians of, our identities. So it's not a coincidence that in this most recent privacy controversy, Chuck Schumer and Al Franken and two other senators sent a letter to Facebook, and the Canadian Privacy Commissioner has been negotiating with Facebook, and the EU has been criticizing Facebook. This is the new level of Facebook's challenge, and it's a big challenge for 26-year-old CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who is still, for all of his talents and vision, only 26 years old. For him to be able to manage this extraordinary set of challenges will be very, very difficult. And we'll see if he's capable of doing it. But I have a lot of admiration for what he's done so far. As I've said, I think the chances are reasonable he'll be able to grow into this new role. But considering that it's a role that no one of any age has ever had to play before, all bets are kind of up in the air. So anyway, that's all I have to say formally, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, and we'll have mics running around. So start over here.
Hi, thanks very much. Your description of the vision that Facebook has really explains what my question was going to be, which is why don't they take more care to create a great user experience? So I think I understand that now based on what you said their vision is, to be the kind of plumbing of...
I think they've had a great user experience from the beginning, which is one of the many reasons they won. I mean, it's sort of like Google. It's a very elementary interface with very little advertising kind of intrusion and stuff like that.
As one working for a design firm, I think there are a lot of designers who don't share that point of view. But that's actually not the question that I wanted to ask you, which is, what do you think Facebook cares about with regard to currying favor with those 500 million users? Do they care that those users are passionate about the brand in the same way that those users
Not the
be passionate
brand,
about?
no.
Okay.
They don't really think about Facebook as a brand, interestingly. I've never heard them actually talk about it that way, which is interesting. I never thought about it before, but I should have probably written about that. But in fact, they think of it as a utility. They love to use this word, utility. And what they mean by that is just a set of functional values that serve your interests that, as they say, they would like to see sort of disappear below the surface. So it could be they will decide they've really got to push the Facebook brand, which effectively has been pushed fine enough without their trying thus far. But I don't think that's their goal. But I do think they very much care what those people think. In other words, they know they need those people to keep using Facebook. They can't risk alienating them, which is why each time Zuckerberg takes he takes 5 steps, and one step is too far, he takes a half a step back to accommodate the criticism, and then he moves merrily on, like I said. But the reason he does take those steps back is because he cannot really allow, a revolt to emerge, because then Google or Company X or Apple, to name 2 potential serious competitors, will potentially usurp his position. Wait for the mic now.
Thank you. Annalie Killian from Sydney, Australia. I was interested in your observation about Mark Zuckerberg really being a unique strength of Facebook, but in that is he also not perhaps a unique weakness because he's just a human being? And I was kind of concerned about the power of one individual and the magnitude of responsibility that he carries, especially in light also of a statement made by Jeffrey Rosen at the opening session yesterday that the future of free speech really lies in the hands of the executives at Google and Facebook and Comcast, much more so than in the Constitution.
I don't agree with that, but I agree with everything else you said up to that point, but I don't agree with that.
You don't?
Well, first of all, if to say that, you basically have to fundamentally reject the point I made at the beginning that Facebook is a platform for the empowerment of its users. If Facebook is a platform for the empowerment of its users, then Zuckerberg cannot, in the end, impose on them his will. That's just, tautological. So, I do think there are innumerable platforms well beyond Facebook. Twitter, I don't think Google provides too many of them, except maybe, they've attempted to try some things, and of course in email. But the individual has extraordinary power in the world we live in a new way that most of us haven't even begun to digest. And this is a huge theme of my book, all the ramifications of empowered individuals, which Facebook more than any other system makes evident. But that is a really old school way of looking at the world. It's a paranoid way of looking at the world that views a few powerful individuals as being the determiners of our fate. I do not consider that to be the case. I do not. I don't even know. Wait, so forgive me, who's Rosen? I may even, what does he do? Yeah, I don't know him. Is he here? Well, it's fascinating. I'd love to talk to him about it, but I really don't think that's a reasonable statement. I do think these companies have acquired surprising amounts of power, but it's generally, in a sense, with the consent of the governed. If we didn't like what Google was doing for us, we wouldn't all spend, every time we go on the internet, we wouldn't be using it. You know, we get tremendous benefit out of these systems. So, you know, I don't think, what I'm saying does not equal that I don't think these systems necessarily should be regulated, because I think potentially they should. But I think to say that our future is in their hands is way too paranoid. There's so many hands. I saw you shaking your head before, so you must have something interesting to say.
So I'm curious about the opportunity that Facebook has in the search space. Because, you know, when I think about search on Twitter, I'm able to get a lot of interesting information very quickly. And in some ways, Facebook has a very, very powerful tool built into the social graph around giving me the ability to search what my friends know about something that I'm trying to find out about, for instance. So
Twitter does, you're saying. Yeah, yeah.
And Facebook too,
both of them, yeah.
right? But Facebook hasn't really leveraged that to the fullest effect. I'm curious about your thoughts on search and also...
It's huge. I mean, Facebook and identity, you know, identity-based information, or let's say it more, social information, is one of the key next generation factors in search, without any question. Eric Schmidt himself has said that on more than one occasion. Google is in a difficult position because as of right now, they don't really have that much access to social data. They have a licensing deal with Twitter, which is the best they've tried to do so far. They're, according to rumors, building something that some say is going to be called Google Me, which is an attempt to build their own social network. I would never put anything past them because of all the money they have. However, they've never shown institutionally the slightest DNA for understanding social interaction. They are an algorithmically brilliant company. They are not a socially savvy company. So there's a huge challenge for them to understand the implications of all this stuff. And they, you know, one of the great stories about that I think is always worth reminding oneself is that there was this company called Dodgeball, which was a location-based, cell phone-based social network very early, in the early part of last decade, which Facebook bought, Google bought, and did nothing with. And then Dennis Crowley, who created it, left Google and started Foursquare. You know, he should have been doing that inside Google. I mean, if they understood how important that was, presumably they would have found a way either not to let him go or to do it themselves. But just to finish, so I think Facebook will enter into the search business, probably in partnership with Microsoft. I mean, obviously, Facebook search is, I think, the 4th largest search engine on the internet already, just for searching inside Facebook, because it's so big. Oh, here's a statistic just in terms of the scale of Facebook I meant to say before. This statistic blows me away, but somebody from YouTube gave it to me. That inside Facebook every day, there are 46 years worth of YouTube videos consumed. It takes a little bit of wrapping your mind around that one, but according to someone who did the math, that's not implausible. Let's go back there, and then we'll come around. How much more time do we have? 15 more?
My name is Michael Conniff, and yes, I am on Facebook. You haven't mentioned electronic mail, but it strikes me that one of the most powerful mechanisms they have in Facebook is the ability to connect to the people in your directory, and that in and of itself.
What do you mean?
When you are trying to get on Facebook, it allows you to interface with Yahoo Mail or something like that. But that strikes me as just, of course I do it and I did it, but it is really an incredible intrusion in a way. And though I think Facebook is overwhelmingly a good thing, I find it that they have actually taken over my mailbox. That I can't get through my mail anymore. I'm even not commenting on things.
Oh, because you get so many messages from Facebook into your email?
Pardon?
Because so many Facebook messages come in to your email? Well, you can go into Facebook and adjust the settings to control it.
Well, that raises, you make that sound easy. It's actually not.
It's not that hard to do that. The problem is then you don't know what's happening inside Facebook unless you remember to go there, which, you know,
it's easy once you know how to do it. But, of course...
Well, their interface is not as easy to use as it should.
Anyway, I don't want to lose my point here. My point is that their integration with electronic mail... Yeah. Could you just comment on that and all the issues? And was that an easy thing for them to do or a hard thing?
They were one of the first to do it. It's now routine, and most internet services in one way or another do it. It was very critical for their growth. The fact that they were among the first to do it is one of the reasons they became the dominant company that they are. And I talk about that and how critical it was when Microsoft occasionally would turn off the links to Hotmail, which was by far their fastest growing, the part where they were getting the most new members was through Hotmail, and Microsoft would sort of play with them by turning it off every now and then. It was critical for them to negotiate that. One of the reasons Microsoft is so close to Facebook today is because Hotmail was such a key growth engine for Facebook that they had to kind of keep Microsoft closely in their embrace. This was before Gmail was nearly as big as it is today. I mean, there's so many things about your question that one could talk about. I mean, Facebook has its own messaging system, which is egregiously primitive. And many people think if Facebook was smart, this would be a top priority, that they should improve Facebook messaging so we would use it instead of email. Now, they could easily do that. They would have one of the world's largest email systems the minute they did it, and in some ways you could say they do already. But instead they have this weird connection to our other email, and it is kludgy. I don't think it's going to last that way forever. There's some real problems with the way it works, so I share your frustration with the clumsiness of it. And I also agree that adjusting anything inside Facebook is much too hard, much harder than it should be. And that's something of a fact that flows from, you know, they have 500 million users, they have 1,500 employees, it's a free service. There's a lot of limits to their own resources, but even more, I think, profoundly, they haven't put enough priority on simplifying that kind of thing. So, I mean, there's plenty of other questions embedded in what you said. I mean, email is a whole nother universe of connectivity that is not the same as a social network, but about which entire books can and have been written, you know. So I do say, though, that Facebook, in one sense, represents the next phase of human communication past email, because it is sort of an algorithmically automated form of communication that doesn't require the sort of willful directiveness that email requires. We have to send a message to another person. Facebook does it for us through its software, and that's always, I think, an important thing to note about it. Here? Wait for the mic.
You're speaking about the effect of Facebook, but what about the effect that it's having on interaction, human interaction? The fact that people will sit with one another but stare at their iPhone to see what's happening on Facebook or Twitter, not introduce themselves to, I have had meetings with clients where before they are able to sit down and have a meal, they'll say 1 second and they'll update their Foursquare to let people know where they are. And you awkwardly stand there for 2 minutes.
Well, same thing you said about BlackBerries too. I mean, you know, people are obsessed with these digital tools.
But what about these digital tools, and how is Facebook addressing the fact that it might really change human evolution? It's changing the brain. There have already been studies.
Do you think that's Facebook's responsibility to address that? I mean,
I'm not sure.
I don't know. I mean, it's a fascinating question. The New York Times reviewed my book on the weekend and criticized me for not supposedly addressing the possibility that Facebook is causing people to actually socialize less.
Correct.
But in fact, there is no data whatsoever that suggests that. In fact, the data that does exist, which is pretty minimal, shows that the same people that actively use these social tools are actively more social people who also socialize more offline. That is very consistent in what research has been done so far. But that doesn't mean that when they're sitting there, they aren't doing something. But then again, it's just to some degree your judgment that that's negative. I mean, maybe they feel they're enhancing the bandwidth of their communication by doing this. I don't know.
But what about the compulsion to use it? Because a lot of people say that they've felt that. And there have been studies that show that people feel more of an addictive.
Well, certainly people get addicted to Facebook, addicted to the internet. There's a lot of issues with that I don't think are necessarily the responsibility of Facebook, but they deserve tons more study. I mean, the thing that's amazing is Facebook got to 500 million in 6 years before even sociology realized that it happened. You know, so, you know, in the last year or two, sociologists and other types of researchers have been doing more study of the ramifications of how dramatically our lives as humans are being changed by Facebook and other services, but we really don't know enough yet. And the way I always look at that is, in a way, you have to basically trust human nature, that people are doing it because they feel they're getting some value out of it, and I don't think you can assume that it's intrinsically negative just because you can imagine things about it that might be negative, which some critics like to do. I mean, I have faith that the 500 million members of Facebook kind of are on there for a reason, Here, or unless somebody has a mic, and then...
I would actually like to add something to that equation, because I do hear what you're saying about the direct social interaction, but on the other hand of the spectrum, there is the possibility to trace back people, be it, and I literally found my prom date from 20 years ago when I was an exchange student, and could certainly all of a sudden interact with people whom I knew back then, and I can keep up with people whom I otherwise would not be able to. So I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a much broader picture, but I would also like to see the benefits being added to the equation when we discuss that.
Well, I think the benefits are being commented on by the fact that Facebook's getting 1 million new users a day. In a way. I mean, that to me is people voting with their time. But nonetheless, we have to understand these questions a lot more than we do. And Facebook has a team of in-house sociologists now that are doing research in some related areas. But there's so many questions. I mean, literally everyone in this room has had their life altered by this system per se, as well as a lot of other things that are coming around it. So how about over here, that person right there? Oh, is that Linda? Okay. Sure, you'll have an interesting question.
Thanks, David. Linda Stone, do you think that Facebook's ambitions are going to invite regulation of all social media? And if so, how do you see that all unfolding?
The thing about governments is they don't really have an ability to keep their hands off things that get big. So call me a libertarian to that degree. I would say in some ways I think it's inevitable that regulation is going to come to this arena. Now, whether it comes only to Facebook, or whether there's other services that are big enough that they get regulators' attention, or whether the rules that are applied to Facebook then apply to Twitter and Foursquare and other systems as well, I don't know. You can just see in the last few months in the reaction to the recent Facebook changes that inevitably that the regulator's attention has finally been drawn, and that's not going to go away. I mean, Facebook negotiated for a full year with the Canadian Privacy Commissioner. And we don't have one in the United States, but Canada has a National Privacy Commissioner. It took a year of dialogue with Facebook. Facebook made some changes in its terms of service, I believe, and in its interface in response to that discussion. And then in this recent set of changes, a bunch of stuff happened, and the Privacy Commissioner in Canada is pissed off again. So, this is just the way it's going to be.
These million new users, are they new users during the hours of 9 to 5?
They're new users in Malaysia, Brazil,
right.
Russia.
My question, I think, is during work hours. I mean, what do the employers do when you've got...
Oh, you're asking about the work question?
Yeah, I am. The work question.
Well, Facebook is used around the clock by people who are into it. Some companies try to ban it, so then people just use it on their mobile device in front of their computer.
Well, is it accurate to this viral universe of the 500 million people that are on it? When you go onto Facebook, don't you sort of compromise the work time servers?
Sometimes, and I think some companies have banned it for that reason. On the other hand, a lot of companies have found that the connections that people get in Facebook benefit their work life, especially people in marketing, I mean, then you have, how is Facebook different from LinkedIn, which is, we haven't even mentioned, LinkedIn is a hugely important social network that is, in my opinion, in some ways, the only other truly global, genuine social network. A very important service, which is all about work. A lot of the things that you can do in LinkedIn, you could theoretically do in Facebook if somebody wanted to make them possible. You know, one of the co-founders of Facebook, Dustin Moskovitz, is building a company right now which intends to take sort of all the kinds of functions of Microsoft Office or Google Docs, that kind of stuff, and build a version of productivity applications that are deeply integrated with Facebook and social media on the theory that bring social to the workplace is a huge productivity benefit. So, you know, there's a lot to be seen still to come in this arena.
And the SEC just banned, FINRA just banned all the social networking sites
Where? Where did they ban them in their own workplace?
in the United States. I'm a registered investment advisor. I own a firm.
Oh, you banned it from people like you using it?
People like my employees using it during the day because it's considered advertising.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, that's controversial. You know, in Italy, where Facebook is like a crazy thing that people use, it's like taken over the country in a weird way. I know the city of Naples, I believe, has an hour a day you're allowed to use Facebook on the job because they couldn't ban it completely. You know, that's the kind of thing, you know. It's hard to ban, it really is. How about back there? A very aggressive hand waver.
Thanks. I wanted to follow up on some of the discussion about sort of the social impact and implications. My following of Facebook began in April of 2004 when I came back from a quarter abroad at Stanford to the end of my junior year. And my best friend said to me, like, you got to see this website. Not only is this going to completely change the way that social interactions are made, it's going to be bigger than Google. And we strategized for the next year on how to get her a job at Facebook, and she became eventually the first female employee and is now a major part of their executive team. And then the following year, I was living with people that went on to become director of product and, you know, the original COO. And so my perspective on Facebook emerging is from like a very personal standpoint of the individuals that have shaped it. And what stands out to me and what I don't think gets enough press, especially in the sort of the story of how it's become so successful, is that what I'm constantly impressed by is that these individuals that make the daily decisions that matter are truly inspired and focused on this massive social vision. And they don't talk about how to reach market cap, and they don't talk about their, you know, profit potential. They truly only talk about the way that Facebook is changing the way that people interact for the better. It's making a more open society. And whether or not like that's true, I think that there's something to be said for the way that the motivation of the employees has contributed to.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I talk about that at length in my book. It's totally true. It's almost bizarrely true.
It's bizarre.
I mean, Mark Zuckerberg said recently at the press conference when he was making the changes in privacy, you know, oh yeah, we have these ad things we're doing over here, but none of our changes in product or privacy had anything to do with any commercial considerations. And he really meant it. At least in his mind, he believed it was true. And he has a core of true believers that surround him who think that same way. And their goal is everyone in the world, on the planet, ought to use this system because it will make their life better, because it will make the world more open and connected. It will allow them to share more. This is what they believe, right or wrong. That's what motivates the company.
Yeah,
That's
and I
true.
guess what I wanted to add is just from a personal perspective, I don't think that's just marketing lingo. I think that that's like
Well, it's clearly
a deep,
something they
deep
really believe,
drive.
you know. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it could be said to be marketing lingo in a weird, roundabout way, but it is what they also really believe. How about over here?
That's good timing for my question. I'm Nancy from Aspen, and they have operating costs, like many companies. And even though, you know, it's very personal and it's a bigger vision, I'd like to know what you think are the most promising revenue streams for them.
Well, you know, one of the weird things about Facebook is Zuckerberg has never cared about advertising, and yet he has always just sort of noticed that no matter what he did in the product, even in the way I was just describing with these new set of changes, he's able to hire people who figure out a way to put ads in it anyway, sort of on the periphery, and he is able to make enough money to pay the bills. And that's effectively true now. And he recently said in an interview with Inside Facebook, it would be crazy of us to maximize profit now. Crazy, that we should just keep growing, and as long as we can pay our bills, that's because he believes, oh, we'll figure out this money stuff later after we get the whole planet. I mean, again, you can call this delusional, you can call this extreme, you can call this insane, but he does have 500 million people using it already, so it's hard to dismiss out of hand. But he doesn't do it for the money, and yet he has money. They're going to have revenue of perhaps as much as 1.5 billion this year without even trying that hard. Now, to say they don't try very hard is somewhat misleading, because Mark did hire Sheryl Sandberg, who essentially created a good portion of Google's advertising business and is one of the great visionaries and leaders of internet advertising, as his number 2. And he gives her a lot of authority to make decisions about that kind of stuff, and she makes a lot of good decisions. And there are many, many hundreds of people who do nothing but sell advertising inside Facebook. So it's not like they don't have revenue over there. And they have other forms of revenue. They sell virtual goods. They're building a currency which, weirdly, Sean Parker, in a panel that I was on at TechCrunch Disrupt in New York about a month ago, predicted that by the end of this year, credits will be a third of Facebook's revenue, according to Sean, who knows more about the inside of Facebook than almost anybody who doesn't work there. So I found that bizarre. But I do think that Facebook's got an amazing opportunity commercially to turn this network of connections that it has and this sort of the genuinely private features that it does still have despite all the controversy into a system that can help you conduct transactions on the internet, and with their credit system potentially take a small cut of those transactions. That could turn out to be by far their biggest revenue stream over time. How about over here?
I'd like to ask a question about whether anyone has studied the nature or the quality of relationships on Facebook. I've had some unusual experiences of becoming friends with someone on Facebook, communicating with them, and then meeting them in person, and they hardly know what to say to me. It's almost as if we can't communicate without being on Facebook.
That's interesting, yeah. There's been some study, but again, it's not been studied nearly enough. To really do that kind of study really authoritatively is a very time-consuming kind of thing. I mean, you really have to do a lot of work to figure that kind of thing out. But certainly, many people would anecdotally tell you that Facebook is full of extremely superficial connections. Certainly, I know most of us accept quote-unquote friends in Facebook way too freely, which means we have a lot of connections that we are not really friends with. And I think it's to our disadvantage, and I do it too. I mean, Facebook is designed to communicate with people you really know. When you accept friendship with somebody just because you don't want to hurt their feelings by saying no, not only are you kind of being dishonest, but you're actually hurting your own Facebook experience, because unless you do actively control your groups, you're getting information that you don't care about in your news feed, which then dilutes your Facebook experience. And even more importantly, you're empowering that person over your data so they have the ability to abuse your privacy. So you should not make friends with someone in Facebook you're not friends with, and yet we all do it. And in a way, I'd say it's a problem that Facebook itself has not addressed institutionally. They don't talk about that enough, again, because they have this idea that more friends are better in some weird way. They should probably be saying what I just said to their members more, and because then the quality of everyone's Facebook experience would presumably increase. So, but certainly there's a lot of superficiality in there, no doubt. Right behind you?
Hi, do you think the financial crisis has had any impact on Facebook and other internet entrepreneurs, positively or negatively?
Well, it had a lot more impact on other internet entrepreneurs than it did on Facebook. I mean, one of the weird things during the downturn was that Facebook's financials almost didn't change at all. They were very concerned that they would, but they didn't. Facebook, during the exact time that the financial crisis happened, was going through such an extraordinary growth spurt that marketers of all types were getting increasingly interested in it, and what money they were spending, they were not unwilling to spend some of in Facebook. So Facebook did not experience a radical financial downturn as a result of the financial crisis, they did see some slowdown, but I think a lot of other companies had a hard time just getting started, getting funding. Although in general, I would say the internet space was less impacted than most other industries during the financial crisis. So, are we finished? Okay, that's it. So thank you all so much.